What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and it's time for another episode of Best Armies in 40K, the weekly video series where we go through undefeated armies from the past weekend of competitive events. This episode for the weekend of August 17th and 18th, 2024. And despite the fact that we are only 1 week off from the WTC, one of the largest events of the year that I spoke about in my last video, we still had a bunch of large events go down this weekend. While most of them were GT sized, between 20 and 80 players or so, this weekend did host the Leeds Super Major, a 200 plus player event over in the UK, as well as a wide breadth of those smaller GT level events. Before we dive into the coverage today, I want to give a big shout out to all the people who support Tactical Tortoise, either over on Patreon. You can join them at patreon.com/tacticaltortoise. You get all sorts of cool stuff like early access to T5S2 pods in my Discord. I have an exclusive area in the Discord as well for patrons that I usually give sneak peeks to new videos, and you can get some other benefits over there. On top of that, folks who support via channel membership to get early access to videos, as well as everybody who supports me over on Twitch. I do stream over at twitch.tv/TacticalTortoiseTV almost every weekday, so please go check me out over there. And let's dive into a metagame breakdown. Adepta Sororitas are back on top. We did see them have a little bit of a quiet week last week, but this faction is continuing its reign as almost undisputably the strongest faction in 40K in Pariah Nexus. They took first and fourth place at the Leeds Super Major. They also took down the Games and Stuff GT, as well as going X0-1, so one draw on their record at CruitCon. I want to give a shout out to CruitCon real quick, just for the results that they had this weekend. They actually had a 4-way draw for first place, 4 X0-1 results, which typically we will see for an event using differential scoring. So a WTC style scoring system that I spoke about in my last video can oftentimes create draws because you have to beat your opponent by a certain margin. CruitCon didn't do that, however. They used a standard scoring system and ended up with 4 ties, 4 0-1s at the top, which is nuts. That's so unlikely, but incredible. And I will be including all of those results on this list. Moving down to Thousand Suns, also had a great weekend and another faction that is performing extremely well. Interestingly, I believe that all of the events this weekend did use the August update, which prevents Thousand Suns from using the torrent weapons with indirect fire, and still did well. And we also still saw a lot of those torrent weapons being included in lists. There was some commentary from the Thousand Suns community that their game plan was largely not going to change thanks to that update, given that prior builds of Thousand Suns in previous updates didn't really have access to being able to consistently warp sight and fire flamers out of line of sight, and the faction was performing well anyway, and we are sort of seeing evidence of that. They took down the Summer Showdown, Games and Stuff, and Brewhammer 6 events. Tau Empire also had a good result. They ended in the top 4 cut at the Leeds Super Major and took down the Saffron Slam. Grey Knights with 2 undefeated results at Mountain View Mayhem and the North and South GT. Death Guard, a little bit of an interesting week this week. They were one of those 4 X0-1s at CruitCon, and we'll talk about that list, but they also took down the Throne of Skulls event. That was an internal Games Workshop event, so held at Warhammer World, but ran only 1750 points rather than the standard 2000. I wasn't sure if I was going to talk about that because it is a bit of a non-standard event format, but I figured I would include that here anyway. Tyranids also with 2 strong results. They did make the top cut at the Leeds Super Major, and they also took down the Happy Birthday Mr. Iberian Goblin GT, which is a hell of a name, and we will talk about that list, running some Crusher Stampede. Space Marines continue to do well with these non-compliant chapters, still putting up results. The Codex compliant chapters are still struggling, but the faction as a whole is still incredibly strong. Space Wolves took down the Hydra GT and also went 4-0-1 at the CruitCon GT. What a shocker. Black Templars, another final placement at that Throne of Skulls event, 1750 points, but they also took down the Come the Apocalypse event. And if we were to amalgamate all their results, they would be dominating the field. Although given the fact that they do tend to have an overwhelming majority of player count, that is not super surprising. And moving on through the Space Marine faction, we also saw Blood Angels X0-1 at CruitCon. Deathwatch, the last hurrah of Deathwatch. This will be the last week we talk about that faction since they are moving into the Xenos Hunters detachment in the Agents of the Imperium Codex. Took down the Kulikon GT. And last last but certainly not least, for the faction, Dark Angels took down the Deck Box Masters. Moving on from that, Drukhari saw an undefeated result at the Brighton GT. And last but certainly not least, a very cool Astra Militarum list coming out of the Mountain View Mayhem. So with that, let's move on to some lists, and we'll rip the band-aid off by talking about Adepta Sororitas. Jack Tight, aka Skauki, a previous T5S2 champion, by the way, with an excellent record over in Tabletop Simulator, took down the Leeds Super Major at first place with a Bringers of the Flame list. This is a relatively standard Bringers of the Flame list. The one interesting thing about it is that it does not include Morven Vol. It does have Paragon Warsuits, but no Morven to give that unit rerolls. Ironically, while she does probably have the greatest synergy, and I will have a video this week talking about her. It's all recorded, but I didn't have time to complete the edit on it over the weekend with all of the live streaming that I had going on. She does have the greatest synergy with Bringers of the Flame, but Bringers of the Flame also has a high enough passive damage output with its long threat range, devastating flamers, and +1 strength that it doesn't actually necessarily need Morven Vol. Kind of a weird love-hate relationship between those two things there. But Jack was bringing two canonesses, one with Iron Surplus of St. Istalela, the other one with the Manual of St. Griselda, alongside the Triumph of St. Catherine, 3 Immolators, 3 Castigators, 3 Dominion squads, and 3 Seraphim squads, 1 of 10 and 2 of 5, plus those 3 Paragon Warsuits. Nice little symmetry in this list. It's the list of 3s. We have 3 of almost everything, 3 characters, 3 transports, 3 battle tanks, 3 Seraphim, 3 Paragons, 3 Dominion squads to go inside those battle tanks. Relatively standard though. Not too much innovation happening here, but if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Adepta Sororitas, turns out they're pretty good. Another faction that's really good, Thousand Suns. Matthew Moran took a similarly standard Thousand Suns build to the Brewhammer 6 event, who's running Ahriman on a disc, 2 disc Exalted Sorcerers, alongside 2 Infernal Masters, one with the Arcane Vortex and one with the Umbrellific Crystal. Magnus the Red, a Sorcerer with Lord of Forbidden Lore to make that guy a little bit tougher to shoot at. He does get that 18-inch lone operative effect once he's joined to a Rubric Marine squad. A Zangor Shaman, 4 units of Rubric Marines, 3 units of 5, and 1 unit of 10, all of those with Warp Flamers, plus a single Rhino to keep some of those Rubric Marines safe on the run-up to the fight, a unit of Thousand Suns Cultists for utility, and 3 units of Zangor Enlightened. Now moving on from that, let's talk about something a little spicier. Let's dive into Tau Empire, or should I say, the Kroot tribes. At the Saffron Slam, James Marsden took a Kroot hunting pack to an undefeated record. This is the Kroot focus detachment that does give you a reinforcement style respawn stratagem for Kroot, makes those Kroot significantly harder to kill, and has a bunch of Kroot only enhancements that are incredibly strong. This gives the list a ton of objective secure, high OC, and relatively resilient frontline infantry that you can use to body block for your more high damage classic Tau units. Things like battlesuits and hammerhead gunships can hide behind a solid wall of Kroot and continue to shoot while being relatively difficult to engage into. James was running an Ethereal, 2 Kroot Flesh Shapers, 2 Kroot Lone Spears, one of them with the Kroot Hawk Flock. Those Lone Spears are lone operatives, and the Flock gives one of them a 12-inch no deep strike zone, letting that guy hold down your backline objective and be super difficult to engage with by enemy deep strikers or uppy downy effect. We also had 2 Trail Shapers, one of them with Nomadic Hunter, and 2 War Shapers, one with Root Carved weapons. We also then had a grand total of 80 Kroot Carnivores that in 4 units of 20, again, tons of high OC, potentially respawnable and highly resilient infantry thanks to the benefits of the Kroot hunting pack. We had 1 Fire Warrior Strike Team, that's the rifle equipped Fire Warriors. Those guys are just a relatively efficient utility unit. For 75 points, you get 10 guys with a 4+ save and a pretty solid gun, which is not too bad. We also had a Kroot Farstalker unit to join all of those carnivores, a bunch of mounted Kroot, including 3 Rampagers and 3 Krootox Riders with repeater cannons, a unit of Kroot Hounds for utility, as well as 1 stealth battlesuit team to act as a spotter. He was spotting for 2 railgun-equipped Hammerhead gunships to give the army some hefty anti-tank. That gives you an enormous amount of scoring potential. You have the anti-tank firepower from those Tau gunships hanging out in the back, and otherwise relying on the Kroot to score enormous numbers of points in especially the early game. Super cool to see Kroot hunting pack on the table. We have seen a lot of Mont Ka do well with the Tau Empire in recent weeks. Less so with these more off-the-wall, non-standard detachments, but certainly there is a lot of power in that hunting pack, just given the fact that you do have so much mid-board control with the massive number of Kroot you're able to bring. Moving over to Grey Knights, Luke Henderson took the faction to an undefeated result at the Mountain View Mayhem. Luke was running 2 Brotherhood Librarians, one of them with a Sigil of Exigence to join into a 5-man Terminator squad. We also had Kaldor Drago to jump into a 10-man Terminator squad to give them their charge bonus and get those lethal hits on the charge. 3 strike squads as well as 3 Nemesis Dread Knights. This is a relatively standard variety of list. It is sort of focusing on those librarians to get some mortal wound damage out. The Sigil of Exigence makes the 5-man Terminator unit incredibly hard to kill, and with those Terminators, they're able to regenerate casualties dealt to the unit by the Brotherhood librarian themselves. So these guys are tough to get access to, and we have another librarian that can jump into the backline in order to perform utility actions. A bunch of Strike Marines give you some mid-board presence with their scout moves, and Nemesis Dread Knights are good shooting and melee threats to back all of that up, alongside a ton of disruption from the big Brotherhood Terminator squad with Caldor Drago that can take enemy objectives. And that moves us on to Death Guard, and the first of our CrewtCon lists. Richard Hill went for 0-1 at CrewtCon with the faction, and a super unique list for these guys. We typically see Death Guard with a relatively standard build, either focusing on big vehicles, Terminators, or their strong Plague Marine bricks with multiple Fented Virian characters attached, and Richard decided not to do that today. Instead, his list included a Death Guard Icon Bearer. This is an interesting inclusion, a 55-point character who can attach into Plague Marine squads, though I don't believe that we had any attachments available to him, but the reason that we include this guy is his ability to once per game extend his aura automatically to 12 inches. That allows you to apply a lot of Death Guard's offensive buffs in a pretty wide area around the table. If he's hiding somewhere in the center of the table, you just acting as a utility unit, you can then affect a lot of your opponent's army with his contagions. We also had 2 Malignant Plaguecasters, again, just some lone characters here. The Plaguecasters obviously have an incredibly strong Torrent weapon, a D6 plus 3 shot, strength 6, AP2, D3 damage attack, which is already pretty good, but they also have the ability to subtract 1 from wound rolls of enemy ranged attacks if they're able to see you. So these guys can debuff the offensive output of enemy armies. That can make the remainder of the army, which is relatively heavily armored, much more difficult to kill, including Mortarion and a bunch of vehicles. We also had a Tallyman for CP regen, and Typhus. Also included with Typhus was a unit of Death Shroud Terminators that he was probably going to jump into to apply his leadership buff, but he is also just a pretty strong inclusion by himself. He comes in with a solid melee attack and that strong mortal wound output. We had a Death Guard Rhino that could embark those characters, alongside 1 unit of cultists, a unit of Nurglings as allies to act as utility, and a ton of vehicles. 6 Mephitic Blight Haulers in 2 units of 3. These are pretty interesting little anti-tank vehicles. It's been a little while since they've seen competitive play, but for just a few points, you get a relatively resilient profile, T9, with 10 wounds and a 5+ invuln, alongside a missile launcher firing either crack or frag missiles, and a multi-melta. They also get +1 to wound against enemy vehicle units. Specifically vehicles, not monsters unfortunately, but alongside the debuffs applied from Contagion auras, and especially that Icon Bearer pushing forward, they can actually do some pretty serious damage, wounding a lot of vehicles on 3s or 4s with those missile launchers and multi-meltas, and with the massive number of them, especially alongside Mortarion buffing them up, they can do some serious damage if you take them in a straight up fight. Backing that up, we also had 3 Plagueburst Crawlers, those guys equipped with Plague Spitters alongside their mortars to act as a more resilient front line with that strong anti-infantry torrent shooting. This list is absolutely wild. It's been a while since we've seen these vehicle-focused Death Guard lists that aren't taking a lot of the frontline infantry, especially Rhino, Embark, Plague Marines, but a focus on the characters to get damage and utility out of those guys, and then backing it up with some really solid armor, especially then buffed by Mortarion, is a super unique build. And that moves us on to Tyranids. The player Kiko went undefeated at the Happy Birthday Mr. Iberian Goblin GT, running a Crusher Stampede detachment. This included a Hive Tyrant, a Neuro Tyrant, and a Winged Tyranid Prime. No enhancements on those guys, because we are in Crusher Stampede and their enhancements are not that useful. We had 2 units of Hormigaunt and a Biovore to act as scoring, alongside 2 Lictors, 3 Exocrines, a Trigon, a melee Tyranid Warrior unit for that Tyranid Prime to jump into, a Zoanthrope unit to jump the Neuro Tyrant into. This unit does have synergy within Crusher Stampede because you can use Swarm Guided Salvos to ignore cover on them. Because they are a monster unit when the Neuro Tyrant is attached, they don't really get many of the other detachment benefits, but that is a pretty useful effect nonetheless, as well as 2 Tyrannifexes, one of them with a Rupture Cannon and one of them with an Acid Spray. We've talked about lists similar to this in the past. The Trigon's a cool inclusion in Crusher Stampede. It is a good disruption piece with its +2 OC once it's undamaged, and then becomes absolutely lethal in melee once it becomes damaged and start getting those hit or wound buffs. And the Tyrannifexes are hard to one-shot, making them, again, pretty good at benefiting from the detachment's abilities, since it's extremely unlikely that you will lose an entire Tyrannifex to enemy shooting. Backing that up with a ton of Exocrines and the buff from those Hive Tyrants makes this army an incredible gun line that synergizes well with the detachment ability. So with that, that, it's time to dive deeply into the endless ocean of Space Marine lists that we have to talk about this week, starting with Space Wolves from the Hydra GT. At that event, Anders Peterson went undefeated with a Champions of Russ list. This included Bjorn the Fell-Handed, a Captain with Black Death, to benefit from that anti-monster and anti-vehicle from the weapon, alongside his devastating wounds when he uses his finest hour. Logan Grimnar to buff the Army's melee attacks, a Murder Fang, Ragnar Blackmane, a Wolfguard battle leader on Thunderwolf, and Ulrich the Slayer. Ulrich is a seldom seen but super strong character. He gives you reroll ones to hit and wound against a target unit chosen at the start of the fight phase, and that becomes full hit and wound rerolls if that unit happens to be a character, monster, or vehicle, which, to be honest, most units in 40k are. That essentially means that he turns his attached unit into a Assault Intercessor Plus. They are basically getting full rerolls against most opponents, allowing him to jump into units like Wolfguard or Bloodclaws and make them super hard-hitting in melee. And that is what we see in this list. Now, following that up, we had an Impulsor to embark a unit of Blade Guard veterans alongside 2 units of Jump Pack Assault Intercessors, an Infiltrator squad, 2 Scout squads, a Thunderwolf Cavalry squad for that battle leader to jump into. That's a nice, fast character with some solid damage output, who you can potentially use to complete your sagas as the game goes on, alongside a big Wolfguard squad for Ulrich, and interestingly, a Wolfguard Terminator squad that I imagine Logan Grimnar is jumping into. Logan oftentimes just operates by himself. It's actually kind of rare that you attach him to a Terminator unit, but it does give him some more protection so he can survive to complete those sagas, so you can buff your army even further. That moves us on to the Come the Apocalypse GT, which was taken down by Cliff Nelson, running some Black Templars. This is a list in keeping with the Righteous Crusaders Horde style list that we saw from the French WTC team over at the WTC last week. Cliff was running Chaplain Grimaldus, High Marshal Helbrecht, a lieutenant with 10 Hauser's Bones to buff his unit with a Feel No Pain if you are upholding the honor of the Emperor, alongside a combi weapon lieutenant with Witchseeker Bolts. That's a nice little points filler enhancement that attaches anti-psyker 4+ and precision to the combi weapon on that lieutenant. Not a huge deal, but it does allow you to chip a couple of wounds into psyker units like Greater Demons or Magnus the Red if you're in a position to do so. We then had 2 units of 20 Primaris Crusaders and 2 units of 10 Primaris Crusaders to join those characters into, 3 Gladiator Lancers to give the army a little bit of backline shooting. That was the one big difference between Olivier Weiss's list from the WTC and this list. Olivier was running almost entirely infantry and just a bunch of melee units running up the table, whereas Cliff's list here is presenting a more combined arms approach with that shooting to prevent your opponent from being able to position however they want in order to absorb your charge. We then had 2 Scout squads and an Infiltrator squad for utility. Now, returning back to CrewtCon, we also saw a 4-0 run result from Blood Angels. Christopher Wright was running a Sons of Sanguinius detachment with some spicy takes. This included a Captain, Chief Librarian Mephiston, Lamardes, and a Jump Pack Sanguinary Priest. The Sanguinary Priest was probably jumping into a Vanguard veteran squad. Those guys' heirloom weapons only comes in at AP 1, and the +1 AP bonus from the Priest is a huge benefit to them. They also have a 4+ invulnerable save, and getting a Feel No Pain from that guy is a pretty big deal. Makes the unit a little stickier to kill. We did have an Assault Intercessor squad for Mephiston to jump into, giving the list a pretty solid first fighting heroic intervener with potential wound rerolls, which is pretty solid on Mephiston's already impressive melee profile. We then also had 2 units of utility Jump Pack Intercessors, just 5 models apiece, a Company Heroes unit for the Captain to jump into, and a bunch of Jump Pack Death Company, including 1 unit of 10 for Lamardes to hop into, and 2 units of 5. Backing that up was a ton of utility units, including 2 Infiltrator squads and 2 Scout squads. Now, jumping into Deathwatch at the CooleyCon, Fred Fortman went undefeated with a Deathwatch Gladius task force. Again, this is going to be the last hurrah for Deathwatch. We're not going to be talking about this faction in the future since they are morphing into agents of the Imperium, but it is nice for the last weekend that they exist as a faction. We are going to see an undefeated result from them. Fred was running a fairly interesting list. This included a Watchmaster, a Captain with Honor Vehement, 2 units of 10 Deathwatch veterans with a combination of frag cannons and heavy thunder hammers, 2 heavy transports, including a Land Raider Crusader and a Repulsor. Those guys could embark a combination of those Deathwatch veterans, and an Apothecary Biologus Eradicator squad, including a fire-disciplined Biologus, plus those Eradicators to get rerolls against enemy monsters and vehicles, a Combi Weapon Lieutenant for utility, and a bunch of other utility units, including an Incursor unit for +1 to hit on those frag cannons, an Infiltrator unit, 2 units of 3 Veteran Bikes, one of the few remaining ways that we can include non-Outrider bikes in Space Marines until the index gets superseded, alongside 1 Jump Intercessor unit and a Rhino to ferry carry more of those Deathwatch veterans to the table. Now, Dark Angels also saw some success at the Deck Box Masters GT. Keenan Elliott took the faction to an undefeated record with a Gladius Task Force build. We've been seeing Gladius Task Force builds like this pretty commonly over the last couple of months, so nothing super exciting here. This did include Lionel Johnson, however, which is kind of cool. Also included was an Apothecary Biologus with Fire Discipline. That guy was jumping into a 6-man Eradicator squad to enact the combo. Azriel, who could jump into an Inner Circle Companion unit, alongside an Assault Intercessor squad, a Jump Pack Assault Intercessor squad for utility, 2 units of Deathwing Knights, an Infiltrator squad, a Land Raider Redeemer to carry those Eradicators to the fight, and 2 Scout squads. Now that moves us back over to the Xenos side of the table with Drukhari. At the Brighton GT, Tom Hampshire went undefeated with a Sky Splinter Assault, a relatively standard looking variety of Drukhari. We've been seeing success from lists a lot like this pretty widely in the Pariah Nexus season. This included 2 Archons, one with Nightmare Shroud and one with Spiteful Raider to regenerate some additional pain tokens. That is a typical weakness for Sky Splinter Assault, so having an additional outlet for getting those pain tokens back is a big deal, especially because this list doesn't include any Chronoses, which is a little unique. Also included was a Beastmaster, Urian Rakarth, who is just a difficult to kill character. He can respawn himself and is a relatively tough nut to crack, so he can just sort of hover around and stand on objectives, and Lilith Hesperax to jump into a unit of 10 witches. We then had 2 units of 10 Kabalite warriors, as well as that witch unit, alongside 2 units of Incubi to jump those Archons into, and a bunch of utility, including 2 units of Mandrakes and 3 units of Scourges. We had 2 of those carrying Dark Lances, and one of them with Haywire Blasters for the higher volume attacks. And the ground-based infantry were embarked into 6 transports, including 4 Venoms for the combat squatting of those Kabalite warriors and witches, and 2 Raiders to include the Incubi teams. And with that, we are moving on to the last list of the week. This is David Purcell's Astra Militarum from the Mountain View Mayhem event. David was bringing a very interesting build of Astra Militarum, and one that has been seeing a little bit of success in Pariah Nexus with the new secret mission mechanic. This included Ursula Creed as the only epic hero in the list. We did not see Lord Solar Leontis in this one. Instead, David was running 2 Militarum Tempestus command squads. One of them was the Warlord. The Tempestor Prime, being the Warlord, unlocks Tempestus Ions as battle line units, and that allows you to score secondaries such as War of Attrition super easily, since those battle line Tempestus can go into Deep Strike once killed, and then just Deep Strike into your opponent's deployment zone towards the end of the game. If not molested, and assuming that you've killed their own battle line units, that scores you an automatic 20 points on that secret mission, even if you've been pushed off primary in the early game, which Astra Militarum can sometimes do against very aggressive melee threats. We also had a tank commander in the list with Grand Strategist to buff the enormous number of Leman Russ battle tanks included in this army as well. Backing that up, we had a unit of 20 Death Corps of Krieg to hold down the middle of the table and protect those tanks, a standard infantry squad, as well as 3 units of Militarum Tempestus, 2 units of 10 to add to jump the Tempestor Primes into and give them sustained hits, alongside 1 unit of 5 to act as a utility unit. Backing that up was a unit of Attilan Rough Riders, just 5 of those guys as a little bit of a counterpunch or utility unit with their fast speed and strong melee attacks, 2 Hellhounds to strip cover from enemies, and then a combination of super damaging Leman Russ, including 3 Leman Russ battle tanks and 2 Leman Russ exterminators. The combination of all of these attacks together gives you a little bit of Adepta Sororitas energy, to be honest. The Leman Russ battle tanks by themselves are low AP but high reliability. You can give them +1 to hit, for example, from the Grand Strategist Tank Commander, then they get hit rerolls targeting enemies on objectives, but shooting at enemies in cover or with strong armor saves usually means that their battle cannons don't do too much damage. However, the combination of the Exterminator and Hellhounds does supplant that a little bit. The Hellhound allows you to ignore cover on a unit that gets hit by them, and they do have a heavy bolter as well as a Hunter-Killer Missile to try to unlock that cover ignoring, plus obviously they're a pretty strong turret-mounted weapon as well. And we had 2 Leman Russ Exterminators to apply +1 AP against enemy units on top of that. That can also combine fairly effectively with the Tempestus Ions themselves, who are bringing a bunch of Meltaguns and Plasma Guns, including the Tempestus Command Squad that's 3 Plasma Guns and 3 Meltaguns. And assuming that the Tempestor Primes included Command Rods, you can potentially benefit from additional shots from the Plasma Guns, on top of +1 to hit from Take Aim as well. So those guys can be putting out a pretty reasonable output of these extremely high AP mid-damage weapons. So altogether, you have some aggressive units in those Tempestus Ions that can rapid ingress or deep strike onto enemies and clear out enemies on objectives. You also have the backline of those Leman Russ all protected by the enormous number of Imperial Guard infantry taking up the middle of the table, just pounding your opponent to dust if they ever show their face. Bit of a downside is that the list is very contingent on opponents touching objective markers to unlock its rerolls. Both the Leman Russ battle tanks and the Tempestus Ions kind of necessitate that the opponent is holding objectives, but if you're not on the objectives, then you're not scoring too many points anyway, and that does mean that the Astra Militarum player has a pretty solid path to victory by outscoring you with its strong utility units and a late game secret mission. And with that, those are all the best armies in Warhammer 40k for this week. Let me know down in the comment section which one is your favorite. Thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.